Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next series on the AOF Wednesday webinar. Just to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for replay off the AOF website in the next day or so. This is the fourth in the series of Wednesday webinars, and today we're looking at the growing interest in certifying Australian grain as being sustainable. Increasingly, we're seeing the markets wanting certified sustainable grain, and this talk today is really to provide some context for that and the way that it already operates, certainly in the canola market. So I will just move to the presentation and talk through, and there'll be time for questions. There'll be time for questions after this. I'll just check everybody can see the screen. Yes. Yep. Thanks for that. All right. I guess just looking at that first slide there, we don't have to look too far to see the growing societal movement around sustainability, whether that's got to do with environmental matters, whether it's got to do with energy matters, whether it's got to do with water. That all is coming under this umbrella of sustainability. And many organisations in the food sector, but actually across the broader economy, are making very broad and long and firm commitments around their sustainability practices. And many of them issue sustainability reports. They are accountable to their shareholders around sustainability, and this trend is not going to go away. So I think from a food industry perspective, and that's the area that we're closest to as an industry, we need to be right across this and be prepared to meet the needs of the market in terms of being able to supply certified sustainable grain. I think it's important that we can get some clear definitions about what we're talking about, because sustainability is everything that's on that slide and a whole lot more. And I think it's imperative that if we're going to talk sustainability, we get some clear definitions. But what I'm going to talk about today is Australian Grain Sustainability Certification, and two aspects are the principles around it. So the majority of Australian grain that is certified under a scheme called the ISCC, the International Sustainability and Carbon Certification Scheme. So I'll talk about that, what it means, how it operates, and then how it actually operates in practice for an Australian farm. So the AOF, the Australian Oilseeds Federation, has developed a process which we call Sustainable Grain Australia, or SGA, and this Sustainable Grain Australia process is actually the way the ISCC is implemented on Australian grain farms. We've obviously been working with canola for quite a while now, but it is increasingly moving on to other grain types. So we'll just start off talking about ISCC and what that is and how that works. So the ISCC was developed out of Germany over a decade ago in the 2000s for the purpose of meeting what was then an emerging trend in the European Union. And it's built on 6 pillars. And these pillars are: principle 1, the protection of biodiverse and carbon-rich areas. So that's really the top of the pyramid. That is the core of it. Then, alongside those, the other principles, like making sure that agricultural produce is produced under good agricultural practice, that it's being done the way that society expects it to be. Similarly with employee conditions, to make sure that there are safe working conditions for employees. That principle 4, compliance with human and labour rights, making sure that employees and their families are being treated in and regarded in a way that meets societal expectations. Principle 5 is that the operations of the agricultural entity are complying with laws and international treaties. And then finally, that good management practices are instituted across the farming entity, and that there is continuous improvement, not just farming for today, but really farming for the future. So those sort of 6 principles are all very good. They're all very high and lofty and very grand, and you can't really argue with them. It's when you get into the detail, that's where the devil comes out, and that's really where the rubber hits the road. And that's what I'm going to talk about now in a little bit more detail about what is lying behind each of these principles. On that principle 1 around biodiverse and carbon-rich areas being protected, they've drawn a line in the sand. The ISCC has drawn a line in the sand of January 2008 and said that, okay, there can't be land use change beyond that date. And the way this is actually measured is through satellite mapping, comparing a satellite map of today of a farm versus that same map of January 2008. And if there is evidence of land clearing, then that farm is automatically prohibited from participating in the ISCC scheme. Now, this is I should put this in the context of where this has come from. And we have to think about a lot of agriculture around the world. I'm just going to, I think it might be Marianne. If everybody could go on mute, that would be great. I'm just not quite sure I can make everybody go on mute so easily here. On mute all, there we go, that's done. You know, in many developing countries, agricultural practices do involve clearing of land. We've seen that for palm oil plantations in Indonesia and soybean crops in and around the Amazon in Brazil. So this is really, the aim is to stop that, but also applies to Australia and Canada and other countries that participate in these schemes. And that includes, so what is biodiverse and carbon-rich areas? Areas that primary forests and other wooded lands, forested areas, designated nature and protected areas, highly biodiverse grasslands, wetlands and peatlands. Now, fortunately in Australia and many Western countries, there's clear legislation that does provide that protection. So if you're breaching any of these conditions, you are almost certainly breaking a state or a federal law around land clearing. The second principle is around environmentally responsible cultivation. So making sure good agricultural practices are being employed. And these are things like making sure that the application of chemicals is done in the right way, the right amounts with the right chemicals as approved. The fertilizers are applied in the right manner, not over fertilizing, not damaging soils, but looking to enhance and protect soils. Making sure that seeds and seedlings are coming from legitimate sources, that there isn't illegal trade of IP around seeds. Plant protection products are those that are as legislated. Obviously, we've got the APVMA here. That watercourses are protected, and that the storage of chemicals is in appropriate facilities that won't leach into the groundwater or be at risk of hazards of fire and other hazards. So that's sort of examples of good agricultural practice. It goes on, I won't go through each of these, but you know, how do we store the diesel? Is the diesel bundled? What happens if the diesel tank's leaking? What does that do to the soil? How do you dispose of chemical containers? You know, mixing facilities appropriate, etc., etc. So really, when you look at all those things, again, you say, well, yep, that's all good agricultural practice. Then you say, well, does that really operate on my farm? You might say, well, actually, I could improve my diesel tank, or I could improve my chemical storage facilities. And these are all the things we're trying to do, or ISCC is trying to do, is to lift that game up to what society is expecting. Principle 3 is really about workers and the environment in which workers are working on the farms to make sure that they're operating in safe ways, that they have all the equipment and clothing that's required to operate safely, that hazards are identified and clearly marked. We've got good accident procedures, first aid kits, etc. You know where the nearest hospitals are, etc. And you've actually got a process for if there is injuries on the farm. And obviously training. Training is critical. We know this very much from our own Australian farming systems, that you've got the documentation, health, safety, hygiene policies, and facilities to deal with accidental accidents that might occur on farm. Principle 4, again, you look at these images, and these images come from ISCC, and you can see that they are geared towards developing nations. But if this scheme, the ISCC scheme, is actually widely accepted across the globe by large food and beverage companies. So it's equally applicable to, it's a scheme we choose to use in Australia. Even though you could argue it's geared more for developing countries, it is nonetheless certainly applicable here. So here, touching on human, labour and land rights, things like access to primary school education, no forced labour, the sort of things that we've seen in the world over the last 2 decades, I suppose, whether it's surrounding cocoa or coffee or Nike sneakers, but those sort of, basically, again, what society would expect of the way an agricultural operation would treat its workers. Principle 5 goes compliance with relevant regional and national laws, and this obviously dovetails back into the other principles around correct payment of wages, correct treatment of employees, around land clearing and so on. But again, a check and balance here that in fact you're operating against within the correct legal frameworks. And finally, use of good management practices, just basic good management practices around record keeping, making sure you're here not just for today and today's crop, but you're actually here for the future. You're actually working your land for future. So that's the 6 principles of ISCC in more detail. Now, when we actually get down to certifying a farm, we're actually getting down to very nitty-gritty requirements. There's a list, a very long checklist that the auditor goes through to ensure compliance, but this gives a flavour of the sort of things that are expected. And as I said, it's really nothing surprising here. It's really very much what you would expect society would be requiring. If you went and asked someone buying a product off the shelf in Woolworths or Woolworths how their cornflakes were produced, you'd expect them to come up with these sort of requirements. So, this is really community expectations and meeting it through a formalised scheme such as ISCC. We talked about the food and the dairy industry. Sorry, the food and beverage industry, and there is a movement or an entity called the Sustainable Agricultural Initiative, and this is where many of the large global food and beverage companies have come together to work together through their own and shared agricultural supply chains to improve the conditions under which their raw materials are sourced. And I mentioned before that companies have got their corporate sustainability statements or publications. They're accountable to their shareholders and being very vocal about their sustainability direction, where they're heading. And it's through initiatives like the Sustainable Agricultural Initiative that companies like Mars and Unilever and Coca-Cola, Kellogg's, etc., are actually able to meet those, because they can get together with their competitors and talk about how they're improving and the challenges they might face in sourcing their various raw materials. So a really important initiative here, and one of the reasons why Australia is really going with the ISCC scheme is that it's fully recognised by the Sustainable Agricultural Initiative. So if Barilla, for example, that's listed here, is a pasta company, if they are sourcing durum wheat from Australia for their pasta to produce pasta in Italy, if that Australian farm is ISCC certified, it is recognised by this Sustainable Agricultural Initiative, and Barilla know that. And so if Barilla has a commitment around sustainable sourcing, they know that that durum wheat from New South Wales has been sourced sustainably if that farm is ISCC certified. So it dovetails together very well. Obviously, this has come about initially, in the interest from an AOF perspective is because the requirement for supplying bioenergy feedstocks into the European market has required certification of those feedstock sources, whether it's palm oil, soybean oil, or in our case, canola. from canola oil from canola. So that's given us Australia, we've been doing this for probably 11 years now, and actually 12 years, I suppose, was 2009. So Australian canola farmers are certainly well briefed and well operating very well within the ISCC model, because that's the only way they're able to supply the European market, which is our &1 market for canola. You know, something like more than we had 3 to 3.5 million tonnes of Australian canola was certified by ISCC last year. That's between east and west coasts for supply into the European market. So huge amounts. And so Australian canola farmers are well briefed about it, but it does, you know, the market is now calling for this across other agricultural and broadacre crop inputs, such as barley. The brewers and the maltsters are calling for certified barley. Some of you would be aware that Woolworths is chasing certified sustainable soybeans for its house brand tofus and soy milks and tempehs, etc. So it's here. We've built a strong platform with biofuels, but now it's expanding into other foods. When we talk about biofuels, these are the sort of agricultural and forestry feedstocks that are certified under ISCC for the biofuel industry, but ISCC is applicable for a wide range of agricultural products, all of which we can grow in Australia here. Key to ISCC certification is the verifiability. It's not much good if Barilla or Unilever or Coca-Cola go out and say a certain thing about their product if it can't be verified. And that's where the audits come in. So the audits really do provide that compliance or verify the compliance with those ISCC 6 principles. It happens once per season and it happens retrospectively. So the audits this year that will happen in Australia in June, July are related to last year's supply of crop. Not every farm is audited. That would be inconceivable in Australia. So the way it operates is the square root of the number of growers. So if there are 4,900 farms participating in the scheme this year or last year, there will be 70 audits, the square root of 4,900. So that brings it back down. So those 70 farms are then physically visited by an auditor with a checklist to check that all those 6 principles and all those aspects supporting those 6 principles are being met. And those audits are conducted by independent ISCC trained and approved auditors. So companies like SGA, Control Union, Bureau Veritas, companies you'd be familiar with, are the sort of companies that can undertake those audits. Okay, so where does AOF come into all this? So AOF has developed a process which we call Sustainable Grain Australia. And really this is to simplify and harmonise the ISCC certification scheme, because the way it has been operating is that each trader and each exporter of canola has had their own pool of growers that they have managed and certified. And that's become complex, costly, and it's also created much greater exposure for growers to be audited, or the number of audits has been quite significant. So the AOF has developed Sustainable Grain Australia to operate as a central office for all those growers under the one pool. And it has a number of benefits that are delivered to the value chain throughout. One is that there's one common grower declaration. In the past, each exporter, each trader had their own declaration. A grower would have to sign maybe 3, 4, 5 sometimes declarations. There is now one common declaration that is facilitated through NGR, the National Grower Register. We have one common management team, so that produces one common set of the processes and practices, and also consistent and common communication about the ISCC scheme across all the farming participants. So as I mentioned before, we had a little over 4,000 farms participate this year under the SGA, and they all got a very consistent message about what the scheme is, what their requirements are, what their obligations are. Of significance for all in the value chain, but particularly for growers, is that there's less audits. because the pool is much bigger, they've all come under the one umbrella. The pool is bigger. The proportional square root to be audited has not grown to that same number, so less audits. And also under SGA, Sustainable Grain Australia, we provide strong pre-audit assistance. So every grower that is audited, and this year there will be close on 70 odd growers audited, each will be individually contacted by SGA and talked through what's required for their audit, and really handheld, I guess, for that audit, which is great. The other benefit of SGA is that it's able to accommodate a wide range of crops. So it's not the crop that's covered, it's actually the farm that's certified. So if the farmer's growing canola, sorghum and soybeans, then that farm is certified for those, can be certified for those three crops. And that's enabled the market, the brewers and the food and beverage industry to be able to pretty rapidly uptake access to Australian certified grain, because, as I said, once one farm's done, that's done for all those crops it might produce. It's administered and led by the Australian Oilseeds Federation, so we've created this process, and it's actually delivered through Commodity Inspection Services. And I should have welcomed at the outset, but James Saunders from Commodity Inspection Services is actually participating on this webinar, or joining this webinar as well. May be available for questions at the same time, at the end, I mean. So just sort of to put a bit of a process map up so you can understand how the process works. Nothing new here. The farmer has a contract with the trader. The trader has, the reverse contract with the farmer. So, and the farmer delivers to the trader or to his nominated point, and the trader then trades that to his end customer or someone in the value chain. No change there. What happens now is that the grower completes a grower declaration through the NGR, declaring that he's meeting all of those 6 principles. And that document is then available to access by the trader as the grower declaration. So that is the new aspect that's come into this process here, is that grower declaration and the process lying behind that. In that the grower details supplied through the grower declaration then come to SGA, the Sustainable Grain Australia central office, and that then creates this bigger grower pool, the square root of which is the audit pool. And SGA, as I mentioned before, provides the communication, advice and assistance to that audit pool of growers. At the same time, trader is providing information to SGA to help SGA establish who the growers are, what they purchased, and that they purchased it in the right year, and that's married up against their grower declaration. So we end up with a pool of 4,000 or 5,000 growers, as it was this year, all of which have signed grower declarations. We have all their details, and we're now able to select a square root of that. As I said, it's about 70 odd this year for the audits, and then the ISC certifying body, that could be SGA or Commodity Inspection, SGA, Commodity Inspection Services, or Bureau Veritas or Control Union, is the certifying body. Sorry, not Commodity Inspection Services, James, you don't have to have a heart attack. So it's SGA, companies like SGA, sorry, what's it called, James? Anyway, Control Union, Bureau Veritas, etc. Certified bodies that then come out and visit the farm and undertakes the certificate. SGS is what I was thinking.
Yeah, what I'll just mention, I will mention. Yeah, so basically SGA engaged, put it out for tender, engaged Control Union to be the overall certification body, do it. What we do as SGA, when we go out to the growers, we accompany the auditor as well. But with all the pre-checking and preparing all the documentations, we don't expect there to be any hiccups when the auditor actually goes out to on farm.
James. Okay. Oops, I just got ahead of myself there. I'll just go. I think that is actually the last slide. Yeah, that is actually the last slide. So, on the back of James's question there, We're right now open for questions. If you may have many questions. There's a lot of information on the AOF website around both ISC certification and the operation of Sustainable Grain Australia. But you've got us now in the grip of your hand. If you've got questions that you'd like to ask around any aspect of ISC certification or the Sustainable Grain Australia process that supports that, then more than happy to take your questions now. Don't all speak at once. Yep. Are there any questions? Just you'll have to unmute yourselves, or do I have to unmute everybody? Maybe I have to mute. No? No, you have to unmute yourself if you want to, or perhaps raise your hand.
Nick?
Yep.
Nick, how would a grower go about getting the certification? What would be the steps?
Excellent question.
I can answer that
Yeah,
if you want.
you go, James.
Yeah, so basically the square root of growers get selected at random, I mean, through the certification body, basically. In the past, you know, people used to go all over the place. So what we do is try and group them, so to save on travelling costs. Last year with COVID, we did it in Victoria, and we did it remotely because we couldn't travel. This year, we're splitting up the 65 odd growers between New South Wales and South Australia. Next year, undoubtedly, we'll move to WA. So the growers don't get a choice when they sign up to the, I'll go on the NGR and sign up to the program. They're making a commitment that they could be chosen to be audited or not. But really, irrespective of whether they get audited or not, a grower's meant to do a self-assessment, do an internal audit check on themselves, and have all the documentary evidence in place whether they get audited or not.
Yeah, but I think that's very good, James, and useful. But I think Marianne's question was, how does a grower actually get become certified in the first place? And so the answer.
Sorry, yeah. So
that's okay. The answer there is very much the trader who is buying that will say, well, do you want to trade your grain as certified sustainable? In which case, then the grower goes into the NGR and completes the self-declaration to say, yes, I've grown this, I haven't cleared land, and I'm treating my workers the right way. And all those 6 principles literally ticks the boxes on the NGR. But in doing so, has to absolutely acknowledge that this is true, that he's meeting those requirements, and that he or she could be liable to an audit to validate that. There's a lot of information on the AOF website, the checklist, the sort of specific details that a farmer may well be asked in an audit. So therefore, we advise the growers to have a look through the checklist first, just to make sure that you're comfortable with what you are agreeing to in the NGR declaration. James, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, already I'm contacting those growers to be audited this year, and you know, always get some, you know, pushback against them that they really have to be aware what they're signing themselves into.
It's interesting because like a lot of the information that you're requiring from the certification, a lot of us already do through the HACCP program for food grade products. And it's just a matter of just adding the grain products into into our food safety programs that would nearly answer most of the requirements that you need.
Yeah, look, I've been doing this for 7 or 8 years now. You know, no one's ever failed. It's all about, and we don't go back years and years. You know, we're only looking in the past, you know, cropping season. So, you know, to prove chemicals, you know, I'm asking for one copy of a reseller invoice, you know, your receipt from your drum muster. So it's
that's really minimal compared to the food safety programs.
Yeah,
James.
it is. It really is. But you'd be really is. And we do as much pre-desktop audit as we can. All the land clearing is done remotely, so we don't even ask that question. So it's definitely a lot less than a food safety program.
Yeah, okay. Sounds very interesting.
Terrific. So, do you have any other questions?
I have a question, Nick. Terence Farrell here. Jane, hi. Is there any physical testing integrated with these sets? So any of the grain handler export audits or quality audits that feed back into SGS or SGA?
Yeah, so look, basically they have their own accreditation. So all parts of the supply chain need to be accredited. So, you know, the grain corps, ADMs are certified as a trader with warehouses. So individually, so that's not, so basically SGA is looking after the grower component, but the individual traders get audited as well. And really the key aspect of is around how they manage their grain on a mass balance process. So they're not selling more sustainable grain than what they purchase. So there's, you know, audits and check on that. I do internal audits on them to say that if they say a grower, you know, has put 100 tonnes under, you know, SGA, I actually do an internal audit on those grain traders to say, show me the, you know, the weighbridge ticket numbers for that grower that add up to 100 tonnes and the associated contract. So all parts of the supply chain get audited. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Yep. So, sorry, question, Erwin?
Thank you for your nice discussion. One question I have, that we know that nitrogen-based fertilizer is the most influential factor on sustainability of the whole pathway for canola being sustainable. My background is basically technical. What kind of activity happened in Australia to reduce fertilizer while it doesn't compromise the volume of canola? Do you have any kind of a story about it?
Yeah, if I just paraphrase your question, I think you're saying that the nutrition given to the crops is one of the biggest issues around sustainability. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
So one of the pieces of work that we did 4 years ago was establish the greenhouse gas emissions attributable to production of Australian canola, and certainly after tilling the soil and any nitrous oxide emissions from that, the production of the fertilizer used for canola was a major contributor of greenhouse gases. So I'm just reaffirming what you're saying, and also it's invariably imported to Australia, so there's the greenhouse gas component of that. Obviously, that's a cost for a farmer to use nitrogen, and they use it judiciously, I guess, knowing that it's a cost and they expect to get the return in an increased yield. But if there's a risk around drier conditions, they'll probably hold off on their use of the fertilizer. So there's sort of an economic self-control mechanism there from a grower's perspective. They won't apply it if they don't think that it will be utilised by the plant. And of course, canola is 60%, 55 to 60% protein. So much of the nitrogen actually goes into develop the protein of the oil seed, which then becomes feed for stock feed and in time human feed. And it's obviously a lot more for crops like soybeans. So yeah, there's the SGA, the ISCC doesn't specifically drill down to the sustainable use of fertilizers, other than they are appropriate and fit for purpose and used in a judicious and a way that mirrors good agricultural practice.
Okay, thanks. One more question: that is it just the thought that any incentive for farmers that use less fertilizer? Of course, they get less volume, but at the cost of saving environment. Is it any program to support, I would say, the farmers that use much less fertilizer? However,
Well, there is a lot of effort to support growers with nitrogen-producing crops, so pulses, to encourage the GADC has done a lot of work over many years and has been successful in encouraging crops like pulses that are nitrogen-fixing into the rotations, and the evidence is very clear that the yields on subsequent wheat crops benefit from prior pulse crops. Similarly, in the sugarcane growing areas, a lot of work going on, and GRDC is now investing as well into the role of soybeans in sugarcane plantations, because sugar growers know that they can get a better sugar crop because of the nitrogen that's lodged through or delivered through prior soybean crops. So I guess there's indirect benefits for growers in supporting them to use nitrogen and fertilizer fixing crops as prior crops to their main crops.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions that people might have? Yes, no, can't see if any hands are up. So I'll assume that I can't even see anybody clapping, which is disappointing. But anyway, that'll come through, I'm sure. All right, look, thanks everybody. We've gone a little bit over our half hour, but this is something that is, the train has certainly left the station in terms of sustainable certification of grains. Australia is very much on the front foot here because we've had 11 years, 12 years of history with canola certifying under ISCC. And now that it's moving into other crops, this year oats and barley in that scheme, and then for next season we'd hope to see soybeans and wheat, sorghum potentially also included in the program. So again, if any questions, don't hesitate to contact myself or James Saunders. And this video, as I mentioned, has been recorded and will be made available on the AOF website in the next few days for reviewing. One question coming up. Oh, it just says thanks, Nick. That's good. All right. That's also thanks for everybody for joining us today. And the next Wednesday webinar hosted by the AOF on benchtop nuclear magnetic resonance and its role in analytical chemistry for oilseeds. And then the following one after that is on the New Zealand dairy feed market. And again, details on the AOF website about upcoming webinars. So thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks.